The night in the city was eerily calm, bathed in the glow of streetlights that flickered with gentle hesitance. The cool autumn air held the remnants of the day's heat, wrapping around Julia as she walked along the quiet, empty street. Her pregnancy was now unmistakable. 7 months of delicate life nestled within her, a constant reminder of the future she was building. Yet this future felt precarious, as if it could shatter in an instant. The rhythmic tapping of her heels echoed against the concrete, the only sound in the stillness of the night, save for the occasional hum of a distant car engine. The evening had begun like any other. Julia had just left a late dinner meeting, her father's work heavy on her mind. She had kept her private life guarded, hidden away from the public eye. The world knew her father as a stern, no-nonsense commissioner, a pillar of law and order, but no one knew of Julia. She kept her personal life outside of the public's reach, away from the prying eyes that followed her father's every move. This was a decision she made out of caution, not just for herself, but for the child she was carrying. Her quiet, private rebellion against a life that often demanded too much. But tonight something was different. There was an odd feeling in the air, as though the streets themselves held their breath, waiting for something to happen. Julia brushed it off, chalking it up to the stress of the long day. She tried to focus on the sounds around her, the steady rhythm of her footsteps, the way the soft wind tugged at her hair. But the unease lingered. It started when she caught sight of him, his figure looming in the shadows beneath a flickering street lamp. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a passerby, perhaps someone lost in the darkness. But as she drew closer, she could make out the shape of the man, tall, stocky, his movements deliberate. He stood still, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, his face obscured in shadow. A jolt of instinct shot through Julia's chest, a warning that she couldn't explain. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just paranoia. But as she passed him, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, a sense of danger creeping along her spine. His eyes followed her. She quickened her pace, trying to drown out the discomfort settling in her gut, the growing sense that something wasn't right. Then it happened. Without warning, the man surged forward, closing the gap between them in 2 swift steps. His rough hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him with a strength that caught her off guard. Julia gasped, her heart pounding as the cold grip of fear swept over her. For a split second, she froze, caught in the confusion of the moment. She looked up into his face, and that's when she saw it, the glint of malice in his eyes, the hungry look of a predator. She tried to wrench her arm free, but his grip only tightened. The man's strength seemed disproportionate, unreasonably powerful, as though every muscle in his body was meant for nothing but this. His hand slid to her waist, pressing against her pregnant belly, and in that instant, Julia's world tilted. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was an assault, an attempt to control her in the most violent, invasive way. The realization came too late, as the man pushed her back against the rough brick wall of the alleyway. The concrete scraped against her skin, but the pain didn't register. She couldn't focus on anything but the pressure on her stomach, the force with which he pressed into her. Her breath caught in her throat as panic surged. She could feel the weight of her unborn child beneath her ribs, the fragile life she carried so vulnerable now, threatened by the hands of someone who didn't even know who she was. In those desperate moments, as his grip tightened and his breath quickened, Julia's thoughts scattered. She didn't know who this man was, only that he was here now, and his intentions were clear. He didn't recognize her as the daughter of the commissioner. Her identity had been hidden too well for that. To him, she was just another woman, another body to dominate. The man's breath reeked of stale alcohol, hot and rancid as he leaned in closer. He didn't speak, but his actions spoke volumes. His hands violated the very essence of who she was, taking what they wanted without hesitation, without remorse. Julia's mind raced, but all she could do was struggle, helpless against the overpowering force. Fear, shock, and rage collided within her chest, but it felt like a distant fire, too far to extinguish, too far to control. The assault was not just physical. It was a destruction of her sense of safety, of agency. Julia's body trembled as the reality of what was happening settled in. She was 7 months pregnant, vulnerable, trapped in the dark with a man who didn't care about who she was or what she represented. He didn't care that she was the daughter of a man who wielded power, whose very name struck fear into the hearts of criminals. All that mattered now was his dominance, his need to assert control, and in that moment, Julia was nothing more than an object. When the assault ended, the world around her seemed to blur. Her hands shook as she pushed against the man, trying to free herself, her legs unsteady beneath her. She staggered backward, gasping for air, every part of her trembling, her stomach twisted in fear, her pulse racing. Her mind screamed for help, but there was no one there, no one to stop the horror she had just endured. The man didn't chase her. Instead, he backed away, his expression unreadable, as if the act had been nothing more than a passing whim. With a grunt, he turned and melted into the shadows from which he had emerged. Julia stood there for a moment, breathless, her hands still clutching at her clothes as if they could protect her. Her stomach ached, a constant reminder of the assault. Her baby, still alive, still with her, but so close to the edge of a nightmare. As she tried to steady herself, Julia glanced around, but the streets were empty. There was no one to hear her, no one to help. Her mind raced, but the only clear thought was the urgency to get home, to safety, to the arms of her father. She stumbled, her hands instinctively going to her belly, as though protecting the fragile life growing within her. Her breath was shaky, but the more she tried to process what had just happened, the more the anger bubbled up inside of her. It wasn't just the assault. It was the complete disregard for her life, for her identity. Whoever this man was, he had just stripped her of her autonomy. And what terrified her most wasn't the violence. It was the knowledge that this was just one piece of a much larger, far-reaching system. She wasn't just a victim of an assault. She had become a casualty in a war she had no say in, a war that was deeper and more insidious than anything she had ever known. The attack on Julia hung in the air like a dark cloud, its presence unsettling and unrelenting. Her condition was critical, but for Commissioner Thomas Harris, the real storm was just beginning to brew. He had rushed to the hospital the moment he received the call. The sterile, cold atmosphere of the emergency room did nothing to calm the panic gnawing at him. His mind was awash with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them made sense. The suddenness of the attack, the viciousness of it, left him with more questions than answers. His daughter, his only daughter, was 7 months pregnant. Yet whoever had done this had shown no mercy, as if the pregnancy had been irrelevant. Thomas Harris had been in law enforcement for over 25 years. He had risen through the ranks of the department, first as a detective in the homicide unit and then, after years of relentless dedication, becoming the city's police commissioner. His reputation as a hard-nosed officer, unflinching in his pursuit of justice, had earned him the respect of his colleagues and the fear of those who sought to corrupt the system. He had seen it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for seeing his daughter lying in a hospital bed, bloodied and broken. Julia's mother, Claire Harris, had been by her side since the moment the attack occurred. Claire, a pillar of strength in the face of adversity, held a quiet dignity as she stayed by her daughter's bedside. She had known from the moment she saw Julia's pale face that her daughter had been through something far worse than the physical wounds. Something inside Julia had broken, and it was only a matter of time before that darkness came spilling out. As the hours passed and Julia drifted in and out of consciousness, Thomas stayed by her side, watching helplessly. The doctors had assured him that the baby was still stable, but the emotional and psychological toll on Julia was far greater than anything physical. She hadn't spoken much, but when she did, there was something in her eyes, something that hinted at a deep, unspeakable pain. Julia wasn't just hurt. She was scared. Thomas could feel it in the room, hanging in the silence between each breath, and it terrified him more than he could admit. The next morning, Thomas was standing outside Julia's room, his hand resting on the cold metal doorframe. His mind was racing, but there was a sense of clarity amidst the chaos. He couldn't understand why Julia had been targeted, but he was beginning to suspect that there was more to this attack than met the eye. The world he lived in, the world of law enforcement, was filled with its own kind of darkness, an underbelly that sometimes rose to the surface, like a vile and unrelenting tide. Julia's ordeal wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just a random act of violence. Thomas had been a part of this world for too long to not recognize the signs. And the more he thought about it, the more he began to feel the weight of something far larger than just his daughter's pain. It was a few days later that Thomas made his first critical discovery. He had spent countless hours in the precinct, sifting through reports and documents, searching for any clue that could explain why Julia had been assaulted. The initial investigation had turned up nothing. No clear motive, no suspects. But as the days wore on, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. At first, it had been whispers in the halls. He hadn't paid much attention, assuming it was just the usual gossip that circulated through the department. But then it became impossible to ignore. Officers had started to talk about one of their own, Nick Hunter, a senior officer with a reputation that preceded him. The rumors were insidious whispers about Nick's violent tendencies, his involvement with criminals, and his increasing disregard for the law he was supposed to uphold. Nick had always been well-liked among his peers, a man who knew how to charm those around him, using his position and charisma to gain the trust of the department. But there was something about him that unsettled Thomas. Over the years, Thomas had noticed the way Nick could manipulate situations, the way he skirted the boundaries of the law without ever fully crossing them. It was a skill Nick had honed, and it made him dangerous in ways most didn't understand. Thomas's initial suspicion was vague, like a thread that refused to be pulled. But as he dug deeper, he uncovered troubling reports about Nick's behavior, unresolved complaints of excessive force, disturbing incidents where civilians were intimidated, and strange alliances with known criminals. There were many whispers, but no one had ever had the courage to take action against him. Nick had managed to stay just one step ahead of any formal accusations, using his influence to silence any critics and bury inconvenient truths. But now, with his daughter's attack still unsolved, those reports began to feel like something more. The commissioner couldn't ignore it anymore. There was a growing feeling in his gut that Nick might be involved in Julia's assault. The possibility that Nick was responsible for the attack on his daughter lingered like a shadow in his mind. Thomas knew he couldn't rely on the department's resources to fully investigate Nick. He had to act alone, off the books, without drawing attention to the fact that he was investigating one of his own officers. If Nick caught wind of it, the investigation would be buried before it even began. The first step was to tap into the department's shadow network, officers who had grown disillusioned with the system and who had been quietly gathering evidence of corruption. Among these officers was Officer Maxine Foster, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for getting results. Maxine had been in the force long enough to see the uglier side of policing, and while she wasn't officially involved in the investigation, she had quietly helped Thomas by pulling files and gathering intel. She had been suspicious of Nick for a long time, and now, with Thomas's inquiry, she was ready to assist. Maxine was able to provide Thomas with more critical information, leads that pointed to Nick's involvement with a criminal syndicate operating on the outskirts of the city. These were people Nick had been seen associating with on more than one occasion. Maxine knew the names and faces of these criminals well. She had watched them rise through the ranks of the underworld, and she knew that Nick's involvement in their activities was more than just casual. The more Thomas uncovered, the more his resolve grew. He knew that Julia's attack wasn't just about her. It was about something far bigger, something systemic. The deeper he dug into Nick's past, the clearer it became. Nick had been playing the system for years, and now it was time for that game to end. Despite all the information he had uncovered, there was one thing that continued to haunt Thomas: the uncertainty of Nick's true involvement in Julia's attack. He had all the pieces, but they were still fragmented. Thomas needed one final lead to solidify his case, something that would tie Nick directly to the assault and expose the full extent of his corruption. And then it came. Through the crackling of a police radio in the dead of night, a name came through. It was Detective Aiden Brooks, a man Thomas had known for years. Brooks wasn't in the inner circle, but his reputation for following the law to the letter had earned him a place on the commissioner's radar. He had been investigating the crime scene near Julia's attack and had come across something that couldn't be ignored. Brooks had stumbled onto a potential link to the CCTV footage, an image of a man who resembled Nick, though the image was unclear. He had been in the area at the time of the assault. Brooks had managed to track down a witness who had seen Nick's car parked near the scene. But there was more. The witness had reported seeing Nick speak to a man who had been involved in a known gang syndicate, one that had been under investigation for months. This was it. Thomas had his smoking gun. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It was part of a larger scheme, one that tied Nick Hunter directly to Julia's attack. The sterile smell of the hospital was overwhelming. It clung to every surface, saturating the air, making every breath feel heavier. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly overhead, their steady hum offering no comfort. Julia Harris lay still on the hospital bed, her mind a battleground between fleeting hope and dark despair. The trauma from her assault had taken its toll, but it was the mental and emotional scars that had truly broken her. For days, she had been struggling with the crushing weight of it all. The brutality of the attack, the helplessness that followed, the isolation she felt. Julia couldn't see beyond the blackness that consumed her. The world outside her room felt distant, like a place she no longer belonged. Her body had been assaulted, yes, but it was her mind that had become the true battleground. The nightmarish images of that moment replayed in her mind like a loop she couldn't escape. And now, the silence of her hospital room only amplified the chaos inside her head. But even more devastating than the physical assault was the overwhelming guilt. The terror that had surged through her veins was nothing compared to the suffocating sense of failure. She had kept her pregnancy from her father, her secret hidden for so long, and now, it seemed, it had all led to this. The feeling of isolation had driven her to the edge, pushing her to consider ending it all. Claire Harris, Julia's mother, had been by her daughter's side since the moment they had rushed to the hospital. Despite her own grief and worry, Claire's protective instincts had kicked into overdrive. She had stayed vigilant, refusing to leave Julia for even a second. But as the hours wore on, Claire began to notice the subtle signs that her daughter was slipping further away from her grasp. Julia had become distant, her eyes vacant, and the tears that had once flowed freely now seemed dry, like she had nothing left to shed. It wasn't long before Claire realized the horrifying truth. Julia had become determined to end her pain. She had made up her mind. No amount of love or comfort would change it. In the dead of night, as Julia lay in her hospital bed, Claire noticed the movement, a slight shift in Julia's hand, and then a glint of something metallic. Claire's heart stopped as she recognized the shape, a small shard of glass, torn from a broken bottle, now pressed tightly against Julia's wrist. In that moment, Claire's survival instincts took over. Without hesitation, she lunged forward, grabbing Julia's hand with all the strength she could muster. The sharp edge of the glass bit into her own skin as she wrestled with her daughter's grip, but she refused to let go. The battle between mother and daughter was a silent one, fought in the dark hours of the night. Claire's voice was firm and unyielding as she held Julia's hand in a vice-like grip. The battle of wills raged on, but Claire's sheer determination and love eventually won out. The glass shard clattered to the floor, and Julia's hand went limp. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she cradled her daughter, whispering promises of better days ahead. But Julia remained unresponsive, the darkness in her eyes still present. While Julia's world was falling apart, Commissioner Thomas Harris was fighting a different kind of battle. His mind was focused, his every action deliberate as he carefully sifted through the evidence, piecing together the clues that were leading him closer to the truth about what had happened to his daughter. His resolve had only strengthened after the hospital incident. He had to find who was responsible for Julia's attack and bring them to justice. But as he sat at his desk in the quiet of his office, a call came, and that would change the course of the day. The voice on the other end was urgent, an officer from the precinct, informing him of a bomb threat that had been called in at his house. The report was vague. There were no details about who had made the threat or when it was supposed to happen. But Thomas knew immediately that it had to be taken seriously. He trusted his gut, and something told him that this was not a random prank. The city had seen its share of disturbances, but this felt different. Without hesitation, Thomas stood up, his mind already racing through the necessary steps. He would have to leave the hospital and head home to secure his family. As much as he wanted to stay by Julia's side, his duty as a father and as the commissioner could not be ignored. The threat to his home could not be taken lightly, and he needed to ensure that Claire and Julia were safe. Just a quick check, he muttered to himself, already pulling his jacket on as he prepared to leave. Unbeknownst to Thomas, this wasn't just any threat. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme designed to pull him away from the hospital, a well-timed distraction meant to divert his attention. Nick Hunter, the very man Thomas suspected might be responsible for the attack on his daughter, had set this entire thing into motion. The bomb threat was a distraction, nothing more than a carefully crafted piece of misdirection. Nick had paid a small group of local pranksters to make the call. The bomb threat was nothing but a hoax, but it would be enough to pull Thomas away from Julia's side. Nick knew that the commissioner was now hunting him, closing in on the evidence that could bring him down. If Thomas was distracted long enough, Nick could slip under the radar. It was a dangerous gamble, but Nick was convinced it would work. He had pulled strings before, and he wasn't about to let his plans unravel now. As Thomas drove home, his thoughts were scattered, consumed by his growing suspicion of Nick and his desire to keep his family safe. As Thomas pulled into his driveway, his mind on edge, something felt wrong. The lights in the house were dim, but everything seemed normal. He quickly checked his surroundings, instinct telling him that something was off. It wasn't the bomb threat that had him feeling uneasy. It was the nagging sensation that he was being watched. Before he could react, a car came out of nowhere, speeding down the street and slamming into his vehicle with a sickening crunch. The force of the impact sent Thomas's car spinning, his body jolting violently as the airbags deployed. His heart raced, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as he quickly regained control of the car. It was an ambush. Through the haze of confusion, Thomas fought to stay in control. The other car, a dark sedan, kept coming at him, swerving dangerously in an attempt to ram him again. The driver wasn't backing off, but Thomas wasn't going to make it easy. With a burst of speed, he swerved, narrowly avoiding the next collision. The sedan sped past him, but Thomas was quick to react, pulling into a sharp turn and trying to block the attacker's path. The chase went on for what felt like an eternity, with Thomas skillfully navigating the streets, avoiding the relentless pursuit of the sedan. The adrenaline coursed through his body, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had no idea who was behind the wheel, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to kill him. After what seemed like an endless series of twists and turns, Thomas managed to lose the car. His heart was pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing as he drove back toward the hospital. He had no time to dwell on what had just happened. The mission was still the same: find the man responsible for hurting his daughter and end it. This ambush only strengthened his resolve. As he approached the hospital, Thomas knew that whatever game Nick was playing, he was now a step closer to unraveling it. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the dangers were real. But Thomas had always been a man who thrived in the face of adversity, and now, more than ever, he was determined to bring Nick to justice. The weight of the city's darkness pressed harder against Thomas with every passing hour. His investigation into Nick was no longer just about exposing a corrupt officer. It had become a battle for the soul of the city itself. Each new lead, each revelation about Nick's tangled network of lies, brought him closer to the truth, and farther from the man he once was. Maxwell Whitmore knew this better than anyone. Once a trusted ally in the department, Maxwell had been one of the first to turn a blind eye to the shadowy dealings that Nick had been weaving. But now, with the walls closing in around him, Maxwell's guilt had become unbearable. The moment he had seen the unmistakable signs of Nick's deepening corruption, he had known it was only a matter of time before the entire network unraveled. What Maxwell didn't expect was to be a part of the unraveling, but the choice had been made for him the moment Thomas began his relentless pursuit of Nick. Maxwell had watched helpless as his former colleague slipped deeper into the clutches of greed and power. There were too many lives at stake now, and Maxwell knew the time for silence had passed. But silence had its price. His hands had been tied for so long, the grip of Nick's blackmail tightening with every passing day. Now, Maxwell's resentment boiled over. Nick had stolen millions from him, taking not just money, but everything Maxwell had worked for. That was the final straw. As much as Maxwell despised the thought of betraying Nick, he knew that in the end, it would be him or Nick. Maxwell's confession didn't come easily. He had always been a man of secrets, one who knew the art of staying hidden in the shadows. But even the darkest corners had their limits. When he finally decided to speak, it wasn't out of loyalty to Thomas or any sense of justice. It was because of his own survival. In the midst of Thomas's investigation, Maxwell had begun to piece together the full scope of Nick's criminal activities. What had once seemed like a small series of favors, kickbacks, and stolen deals was now a vast, interwoven network of crime. Nick wasn't just a bad apple. He was the heart of a system that had been feeding off the city's corruption for years. But the deeper Thomas dug, the more dangerous the investigation became. Nick was no fool. He had eyes everywhere, and he would not go down without a fight. That's where Maxwell came in. With his knowledge of the inner workings of the department and his own complicated history with Nick, Maxwell was able to help connect the dots that Thomas had been struggling to uncover. But even in his moment of weakness, Maxwell was careful. He wasn't just handing over information freely. He was asking for something in return. The price for his betrayal was simple revenge. Nick had taken everything from Maxwell, his money, his status, and his dignity. Now, Maxwell wanted to see Nick pay for it. He wanted Thomas to bring him down, but not just as a cop. He wanted to destroy Nick the way Nick had destroyed him. Maxwell's deal was clear. Help Thomas bring Nick down, and he would finally get the satisfaction of watching his former partner burn. While Maxwell's role in the investigation was critical, it was Maxine Foster who provided the missing piece. A former detective whose career had been derailed by corruption within her own department. Maxine had spent years working in the shadows, observing and uncovering secrets that others couldn't see. Her sharp mind and meticulous attention to detail made her invaluable to Thomas's investigation, though it wasn't just her skills that brought her into the fold. It was her own vendetta against Nick. Maxine had been one of the few who saw through the lies early on. She had witnessed firsthand how Nick used his position to manipulate and control those around him. When she was forced to leave the force under mysterious circumstances, she knew she couldn't stay out of the fight for long. Her skills, honed over years of working on cold cases, were precisely what Thomas needed. It was Maxine who had unearthed the encrypted emails between Nick and his associate Andre Wright. The discovery was the key to unlocking Nick's hidden empire of illegal dealings. Without Maxine, Thomas would never have been able to connect the dots between Nick's network and the shady business deals that had funded it. But Maxine wasn't just a source of information. She was a strategist, someone who could see the bigger picture when others were focused on the details. She knew how to outsmart Nick, how to play the game from the shadows. While Thomas was busy collecting evidence, Maxine was working behind the scenes to track down every lead, every whisper that could bring them closer to Nick. Her methods were unconventional, and they didn't always sit well with Thomas. But in a case like this, where the stakes were so high, there was no room for hesitation. Maxine's willingness to get her hands dirty made her an indispensable ally, even if it meant crossing a few lines along the way. As the investigation closed in on Nick, his world began to crumble. The connections that had once shielded him from justice were beginning to unravel, and the walls that had seemed so impenetrable now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Nick had always prided himself on being untouchable, but now he was learning that no one was invincible. Paranoia crept in. Nick began to suspect that someone was watching him, someone who had been getting too close for comfort. He knew that Thomas had been asking questions, and he had learned that Maxine was digging deeper than anyone expected. But what Nick didn't know was that Thomas wasn't the only one who wanted him gone. The city was on edge. The whispers of corruption, once buried deep in the dark corners of law enforcement, were now open for all to see. Thomas had done it. He had exposed Nick for what he truly was, a malignant cancer festering within the very institution sworn to protect the people. The evidence was irrefutable, the footage damning. Through a calculated leak to the press, Thomas had exposed the full extent of Nick's network, showcasing his deals with criminals, the stolen funds, and the murders that Nick had orchestrated to maintain his stranglehold on power. The moment the footage aired, the media frenzy was explosive. Headlines screamed for justice. The public was in a frenzy, demanding accountability. But Nick, true to his nature, was not one to go down quietly. He vanished, disappearing into the shadows like the snake he was. An APB was issued for his arrest, and federal agencies, the FBI, DEA, and even a few high-ranking members of the CIA, were brought in to assist the investigation. The walls were closing in on him. But Nick wasn't afraid of the law. He had been in the game too long, too comfortable in his power, and now, with his empire crumbling, he would take everything down with him if he had to. Thomas knew Nick would come for him. It was only a matter of time. The question wasn't if, but when. And when Nick came, Thomas would be ready. For weeks, Thomas had been preparing. The investigation had taken its toll. His family had been under constant watch, their movements scrutinized by security teams who had been hired to protect them. Every entrance to the house was fortified. Motion detectors lined the perimeter. Video cameras blinked to life with every step in the yard. The usual hum of the house was replaced by the constant vigilance of a military-grade security system. But Thomas wasn't just relying on surveillance. He was anticipating Nick's every move. For someone like Nick, pride was everything. He had always considered himself untouchable, and that arrogance would be his downfall. Thomas used this to his advantage. He knew Nick would be desperate to confront him, desperate to get close enough to do the damage he had planned. Nick was used to the rush of power, used to controlling the narrative. He wouldn't be able to resist a confrontation, and that's exactly what Thomas wanted. The trap was set meticulously. Thomas, aided by Maxine and a few trusted officers, had learned from Nick's previous patterns. They knew that Nick was a creature of habit. He would never just give up, even when surrounded by forces stronger than him. Nick would want to prove a point. The house, which had been fortified to withstand an assault, was only one part of the plan. The real danger for Nick lay in his inability to control his own instincts. Thomas had set up the interior of his house like a labyrinth, a maze of dead ends and carefully planned escape routes. He knew that Nick would try to work his way through the house, using his knowledge of the layout to find him. But Thomas had prepared every room, every corner. The lights in the hallway flickered with a low red glow, casting an ominous hue over the rooms. Thomas had taken great care to make sure that every area Nick would think he could use was compromised. Windows that once provided escape routes had been sealed, the locks on doors reinforced. Maxine's job had been to plant clues, false leads meant to make Nick think he was closing in on Thomas. Each clue had been timed perfectly, leading Nick deeper into the house, where the traps would close in around him. Thomas had gone over the plan with Maxine and the others 100 times, leaving nothing to chance. Even the most unexpected twists had been anticipated. Nick wouldn't just walk into a trap. He would run headlong into a series of calculated missteps. It was a late evening when it happened, just as Thomas had predicted. His phone buzzed, signaling a security breach. Nick was inside the house. The last few minutes had played out exactly as planned. A motion sensor in the back had detected his presence, triggering the silent alarm. The footage from the security cameras showed a shadow moving across the hall. Nick had arrived. With cold precision, Nick moved through the house, his gun raised, eyes scanning the rooms. He moved like a predator, every step calculated. But what Nick didn't know was that Thomas had already anticipated his route. The cameras followed Nick's every movement, showing him moving down the hallway toward the kitchen. Nick's first mistake was thinking Thomas would be hiding there. It was a decoy, an empty room waiting for him to fall into the trap. Nick's second mistake was rushing to the basement stairs, where he believed he'd find a hidden escape route. But the basement had been rigged. Once Nick's foot touched the first step, a mechanism triggered, locking the door behind him. He was trapped in a confined space, the walls closing in. For a moment there was silence. Nick's breathing grew heavier. the weight of his realization sinking in. He was surrounded. But Nick was no ordinary man. He wasn't going to give up easily. He reached into his jacket, drawing his weapon and firing a few shots toward the nearest window to test his surroundings. He knew he had to force his way through, or he wouldn't get another chance. The first shot hit the wall, ricocheting with a sharp crack. But as Nick made his move, he was not alone. From the shadows, Maxine appeared. Her face was hard, focused. There was no hesitation in her actions. She moved with precision, taking cover behind a column as Nick's bullets whizzed past her. In a fluid motion, Maxine emerged and aimed at Nick, catching him off guard. She fired a warning shot, aiming just below his waist. The blast caught Nick in his leg, causing him to stumble. He retaliated quickly, his eyes burning with fury as he tried to advance. But his movements were slower now, weakened by the pain. He swore under his breath as he tried to make it to the hallway. But Maxine was relentless. She darted toward him, moving like lightning, and with one final decisive shot, she incapacitated him. Nick crumpled to the ground. His grip on his weapon faltered, and his chest heaved with the weight of his defeat. It was over. The man who had once terrorized the city, the corrupt officer who had played the system, was now at the mercy of those he had wronged. The moment Nick hit the ground, Thomas entered the room, his presence imposing. His eyes locked on Nick, who was now writhing on the floor, unable to escape. There was no satisfaction in Thomas's eyes, no sense of triumph, just cold, hard justice. Maxine approached slowly, keeping her weapon trained on Nick. She cuffed him, securing him before Thomas spoke. But Thomas didn't need words. His actions had already spoken for him. The law had caught up with Nick, and the weight of it was crushing. It wasn't just the physical blows Nick had endured. It was the crushing weight of betrayal, the realization that the empire he had built was no more. The world he had constructed on lies and manipulation had crumbled. As the authorities arrived, ready to take Nick away, Thomas couldn't help but feel the smallest flicker of something, relief, perhaps, but also the haunting knowledge that this was just one victory in a much larger war. The city, for all its corruption and darkness, had taken one step toward redemption, but the fight was far from over. Thanks for watching. If you're into thrilling stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Would you have made the same moves? Tap that like button if you're ready for the next face-off.